now we have a new Democratic candidate in the presidential race, and that's Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And he kicked off his campaign with a speech calling out the CIA and the U.S. national security state.
Yeah, I mean, it was a long stem winder of a speech. And we'll talk about the meaning of RFK's candidacy or how I see it in a minute. But one thing that's important to note before we get into this is that if you look at the way that RFK is being described in mainstream media, they always call him an anti-vaccine activist. And in his speech, he spent much more time talking about the war state and what he is going to do about it and how he will foster peace and peaceful international relations than he did about vaccines. In fact, as our colleague Jeremy Lafredo pointed out, he only said the word vaccine once. He spent much more time on the harm of lockdowns and what it did to vulnerable communities in the U.S., poor communities, as well as the economy itself in driving inflation. But I clipped out much of his comments on the war state, and it was stirring, honestly. I have not heard a Democratic candidate talk like this in my entire lifetime. So let's hear what he had to say about the CIA specifically. I mean, there were long comments about the Ukraine proxy war, and I'll summarize some of them. But this is, stuff we say on the Grayzone all the time.
And my uncle came into office 2 months later. He was fighting his intelligence apparatus, his military, because they wanted to invade. They wanted to do the Bay of Pigs. He was totally against it, and he let them roll over him. And in the middle of the Bay of Pigs, he realized they were lying to him, and he realized the function of the intelligence agencies had become to provide the military-industrial complex with a constant pipeline of war. And he came out during the middle of the night during the Bay of Pigs catastrophe, and he said, I want to take the CIA. Alan Dulles had lied to him, Charles Cabell, Richard Bissell, Louis Lemitzer, Curtis LeMay had all lied to him through their teeth. And he said, I want to take the CIA and shatter it into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds.
They're cheering for the destruction of the CIA.
And George W. Bush had the same problem. George W. Bush says the worst mistake he made as president was listening to CIA Director George Tenet tell him it was a slam dunk that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. And so the neocons and CIA got to go into Iraq and throw out and do regime change. And we got now we spent $8 trillion. And what do we get for that $8 trillion? Nothing. Worse than nothing. Iraq is now much worse off than it was when we went in there.
Well, he goes on to describe in the same way that I did in the management of savagery, how the destruction of Iraq led to the rise of ISIS. He said, we created ISIS. RFK Jr. said, we created ISIS, and it led to a migration crisis with millions of migrants heading to Europe, which then led to Brexit. And those were the exact same conclusions I drew in the management of savagery. And RFK Jr. has hosted me on his podcast to talk about Ukraine. He's hosted Scott Ritter recently to talk about Ukraine. He even more recently hosted the Assange family, John and Gabriel Shipton, to talk about Julian Assange. This is someone who understands the war state as well as we do here at the Grayzone, though he comes at it from a slightly different angle. Aaron, I know you got to go in a half hour. You got to start the Jimmy Dore live stream.
Yeah. I just want to say quickly on this, it's interesting. So now we have two sort of dissenting Democratic candidates in the presidential primary, Marianne Williamson and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And Marianne Williamson, I have a certain admiration for her personally. I like her personally, but her views on these issues having to do with foreign policy, I find pretty abhorrent. And it's interesting to compare the reaction to her running in the race with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I mean, she, of course, was slammed for challenging Biden, but she's, I think, getting more attention and more favorable coverage than RFK is getting. And I think that has to do with, not RFK's stance on vaccines, but his stance on the national security state, where he's an actual principled critic, whereas Marianne Williamson, unfortunately, because I think it actually goes against the principles that she espouses, buys into a lot of the propaganda put out by the national security state.
Yeah, she was a huge supporter of the Ukraine proxy war, U.S. providing military aid, and even got into shouting matches with people at events supporting Julian Assange here in D.C. So, I mean, I think with RFK in there, I don't know what kind of appeal Marianne Williamson can actually offer disaffected, anti-war Democrats or progressives who are just disgusted with where the Democratic Party is going. In any case, I'll let you go if you need to you need to bounce.
All right. See you soon, Max.
All right. Thanks a lot, Aaron. Good seeing you. And everyone, check out Aaron on Jimmy Dore in about a half hour. We're going to continue with some RFK highlights. Now, RFK also addressed the Ukraine proxy war, and his comments were, I would say, more measured than I would have been. He offered, first of all, praise for his son, Connor, who actually fought in the International Legion, which we've written about in the Grayzone. And, it's your son. So what are you going to say? He's saying he's supportive of his son, and he was supportive of the humanitarian goals as expressed in U.S. propaganda, but that in reality, this is not a war for any humanitarian end. It is actually about slaughtering Russians and sacrificing Ukrainians in order to weaken Russia, and that it actually has no end game. It's just another permanent war.
And it's many of the same people who are around the neocons who are around.
And he's hammering the neocons. I mean, we never hear anyone hammering the neocons anymore.
I've been talking about that for a long time
on the national stage, except at least within the Democratic Party
in the Ukraine since 2014. And then President Biden's Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, validated President Biden's statement by saying that our objective in the Ukraine is to exhaust and degrade the Russian army so they're incapable of having battles anywhere else in the world. Now, and indeed, many of the steps that we've taken in the Ukraine have seemed to indicate that our interest is in prolonging the war rather than shortening it. So if those are our objectives, to have regime change and exhaust the Russians, that is completely antithetical to a humanitarian mission. If we're there for a humanitarian mission, it means to reduce bloodshed and bring an end to the war quickly. If we're there to exhaust the Russians or regime change, then doesn't it mean that the Ukraine is just a pawn in a geopolitical battle between two great superpowers, and that our strategy is to put the flower of Ukrainian youth into an abattoir of death in order to exhaust Russia? And if that's true, then we need to know about it. If it's not true, then we need a pretty good discussion with the president and the Secretary of Defense and others to tell us exactly what are we doing there. And
so to sacrifice the flower of Ukrainian youth in an abattoir of death in order to exhaust Russia, that's his perspective on the Ukraine proxy war. That's my perspective on it. This was a stirring address in which RFK, in my opinion, it was stirring, maybe because I've been so disillusioned with presidential candidates over my lifetime, where he actually linked the war state to violence and oppression at home and invoked the Riverside Baptist Church tradition of Martin Luther King breaking with the civil rights movement to condemn the Vietnam War, his own father's condemnation of the Vietnam War, and the traditions going back to the founders, John Quincy Adams, warning against seeking enemies abroad and going out in search of monsters to destroy. This is something we will never hear from a Democrat. The Democratic Party is the party of war. Donald Trump, who's the most popular figure in the Republican Party, is currently denouncing the neocons and denouncing the Ukraine proxy war. Maybe he's coming at it from a different angle than RFK, but no one else in the Democratic Party is doing this. And this really speaks to what the Democratic Party and its base have become. I know the Democratic Party's base because I live in a big blue city. I live in the nation's capital. And, you know, you see with the gentrification that's been overwhelming this city since this regime change operation that took out Marion Barry and brought in all these sort of technocrats. Now the mayor is like a Bloomberg disciple, that the people who are moving into the city, many of them actually benefit from the war economy, the post 9/11 Afghanistan, Iraq war economy. They're contractors. They work at the, defense firms. They work at the Beltway bandits like Booz Allen Hamilton that feed off of the war state, whose budget, the real defense budget, the real military budget is like $1.3 trillion. They're intelligence agents. I actually found out that someone who had moved down the street from me was a CIA operations officer working on China. So they're also extremely liberal and extremely progressive on social issues. Then you have the old Democratic Party base, the people who might have supported John F. Kennedy, who were union workers, who lived in the Rust Belt. And what happened to them? Well, in the 1990s, when the Democratic Party made this pivot to the right, when the Democratic Leadership Conference, the DLC, started rustling up Wall Street money and replacing union money with it, then they got Bill Clinton in, who lied about what he was going to do with NAFTA. He passed NAFTA and sent all those union jobs, particularly in the Rust Belt, abroad. And those same people, if they weren't already casualties of the opioid epidemic, they gave the Democratic Party establishment the finger and voted for Donald Trump in 2016. RFK is summoning the old Democratic Party that actually used to have some anti-war wing and its old base, and bringing them together with a part of the base that I think is dormant or so disaffected that they've gone into independent politics, which is the sort of activist part of the base, the people who might have, the boomers who might have protested the Vietnam War, their children and grandchildren who are anti-war. He's summoning them. In that way, he's a true centrist candidate who has the capacity to actually challenge both Joe Biden and Donald Trump for their respective bases, and not the kind of centrist Bill Clinton candidate who represents the corporate center or the center that the elite has situated. What will they do to RFK? What would they do to someone who challenged the lockdowns, who questioned the efficacy and safety of the mRNA vaccine before it was even on the market? What would they do to someone who has hosted me on his podcast, who hosts Scott Ritter, who hosts Gabriel and John Shipton, who thinks in many ways like we do, but who also represents the legacy of Camelot? Well, we have some indication of a small indication of the kind of dirty tricks that are going to be pulled on RFK based on what took place at his announcement in Boston. And
we were spending $8 trillion bombing bridges, ports, roads, and hospitals. They were spending $8 trillion building bridges, roads, ports, and hospitals.
He's talking about China. He's talking about China's Belt and Road Initiative, and he's praising the wisdom of China's Belt and Road Initiative, and putting it forward as a model for what the United States should be doing instead of exporting weapons and death everywhere, that the US should be building infrastructure and forging ties with countries in the developing world instead of imposing its will on them.
And they are now displacing us as trade partners. Most of the African nations, Latin America, Brazil, just switched to Chinese currency away from the dollar. Saudi Arabia just switched away from the dollar. So these are...
So someone pulled a fire alarm.
Okay, we're okay. I'm going to finish up, I promise. I'm going to shut up in a minute.
I think the fire alarm still keeps going.
So the Chinese, so we've now lost.
Now the fire alarm continues, so someone pulled another fire alarm.
Ooh.
They're calling for an evacuation plan. I actually found this kind of disturbing, knowing the history.
Okay. Nice try.
So he gets that it was a dirty trick trying to shut him down. I got to say, you know, I was disturbed by that because I thought of the images of the Ambassador Hotel and his own father standing on a podium when someone or something else sabotaged his campaign, which was aimed straight at the Vietnam War, in some ways co-opting Eugene McCarthy's campaign. Bobby Kennedy believes that Sirhan was not the actual assassin. He believes that U.S. intelligence was involved in the killing of his father and uncle, which also makes him an extreme threat to the forces that control U.S. politics and substantially the Democratic Party. I mean, this is just not someone they want out there speaking. And we all know the threat of Donald Trump is not actually what he will do. The threat is what he will say. RFK poses the same threat, except that I think he's more sincere than Trump was about ending the wars, bringing the troops home, and fostering an environment of peace where the U.S. is actually a player in a multipolar world instead of the dominant hegemon in a unipolar world, imperial world order. And that's the kind of leadership this country needs at this point. If it doesn't receive that kind of leadership, there will be a two-front war with Russia and China in the near future, in my opinion. So how is the press treating RFK? So far, it seems like they're trying to ignore him. But we also have Reuters listing him among its presidential candidates, and it lists 13 candidates, ignores Marianne Williamson, and then puts RFK's name in, Vivek Ramaswamy's in bold print. Mike Pompeo, who's announced that, God told him and his wife not to run for president, is listed as a candidate. RFK, his name is not in bold print, and here it is, anti-vaccine activist. That's his entire contribution to humanity, is anti-vaccine activist. And then it notes that he's been banned from YouTube and Instagram for spreading misinformation about vaccines and the COVID-19 pandemic. No mention of the fact that Reuters is part of the Trusted News Initiative, and Reuters fact checkers are actually involved in the censorship of dissident voices from YouTube and Instagram, or that Reuters CEO, the chief executive officer of Reuters, Jim Smith, sits on the board of Pfizer. So those are the forces that he's up against. And it'll be interesting to watch this campaign. I've been looking for some campaign that would provide an opening for independent media, alternative anti-war media to actually have more of a voice on a national level. And so I'm hoping that this could be it. I don't think Jimmy Dore is going to be running, but he's definitely thrown down the gauntlet against the Democratic Party.